Gideon Varr was a former state trooper who had survived an ambush that never really ended. The gunfire stopped years ago, but the sound still lived inside him. Metal echoes felt like explosions. Silence felt dangerous. Sleep came in fragments, and guilt filled the spaces between breaths. He told himself he was managing until one winter afternoon, at the edge of a snow-covered market no one visited. Unless they were lost, he heard the sound of steel being kicked. Inside an iron cage sat a German shepherd, full-grown, scarred, and unnervingly calm. "Doesn't listen," the owner snapped. "Disobedient, $30. The dog didn't bark, didn't flinch. He only looked up. And in those amber eyes, Gideon saw something he hadn't seen since the day everything broke. Discipline without hope, loyalty without a handler, a soul still standing watch even after being abandoned. Gideon paid $30, believing he was rescuing a problem dog. He didn't know he was meeting the one being trained quietly, patiently to save him. Before the story begins, please subscribe and leave a like. Your support helps us share stories of quiet miracles, second chances, and the faith that finds us when we least expect it. Snow-covered Brackenridge, Montana, as if the sky had grown tired and shaken its white burden onto the town. Daylight arrived pale and brief, while night fell early, and heavy swallowing sound beneath cold air and drifting flakes. Gideon Varr had learned to move through winter quietly. At 41, he carried himself with the stiff economy of a man who no longer wasted motion. Tall, broad-shouldered, his posture slightly forward as if bracing against a wind that never truly stopped. His hair, once a deep brown, had thinned at the temples and faded toward ash, kept short out of habit rather than vanity. A rough shadow of beard framed a square jaw scored with faint lines, creases, earned not from age alone, but from nights clenched too tightly around memories that refused to loosen their grip. His eyes were gray, watchful, the kind that measured rooms by exits and people by hands, not faces. There had been a time when Gideon smiled easily, laughed loudly, trusted the ordinary rhythm of days. That man had been a state trooper who believed routine could hold the world together. Then came the ambush outside Miles Junction, gunfire, shouting a flash that arrived faster than thought. He survived. 2 others didn't. Since then, PTSD followed him like a living thing, snapping at his heels. When metal clanged or voices sharpened too suddenly, he left the force 3 years earlier, officially on medical leave, unofficially, because he could no longer promise he wouldn't freeze when it mattered. That morning, Gideon told himself he needed a bolt for the loose hinge on his garage door. It was a thin excuse, but it was enough to get him dressed and moving. The weekend snow market on the edge of town sat near the old rail spur behind warehouses whose brick walls remembered better decades. He kept his coat zipped high, wool scarf tucked tight at his throat, boots crunching over packed snow as he walked between rows of stalls patched together from tarps and plywood. The air smelled of diesel exhaust, cheap grilled meat, and cold iron. Radios murmured country songs under the wind. Coins clinked. Someone laughed too loudly, too close. Gideon adjusted his breathing, counting silently, grounding himself in the present. He was turning toward a table of tools when he heard the sound that stopped him cold. Steel rang against steel, sharp, deliberate, followed by a hollow rattle, then a kick. Gideon's chest tightened. For a split second, the market dissolved into heat and dust and the ringing aftermath of an explosion. His vision tunneled. He steadied himself against a stack of crates, jaw-locked, breath shallow. Then he heard a voice thick with irritation. "Move, damn it." The words came with another metallic jolt. Gideon forced himself to look. At the far edge of the lot, near where snow melted into gray slush, a battered pickup truck idled beside a rust-flecked iron crate. The crate was too small for comfort. Its bars bent slightly inward, the latch scarred as if from repeated impacts. Inside sat a German shepherd, full-grown, likely 5 or 6 years old. The dog's coat was the classic black and tan, but dulled by grime and neglect, fur lying flat instead of proud. One ear tipped a fraction lower than the other. The animal's build was solid but lean muscle, defined beneath skin that had known hunger. What held Gideon was the dog's eyes. Amber, steady, unnervingly calm, not fearful, not aggressive, simply aware. Standing over the crate was the seller, a man in his late 40s, thick through the neck and shoulders, belly pressing against a stained canvas jacket. His face was red from cold or temper, perhaps both, and his hands were large, blunt, scarred by years of labor he no longer respected. His name, Gideon would later learn, was Brock Tiller, a man known around Brackenridge for burning through jobs and patience at the same pace. Brock yanked the crate once more with his boot, the bars rattling in protest. $30. Brock shouted to no one in particular. That's it, 30. Dog doesn't listen, won't obey a damn thing. Tried everything. He spat into the snow. Done with him. A few people slowed, glanced, then kept walking. In Brackenridge, people learned early what not to see. The dog did not bark, did not lunge, did not shrink back. He simply lifted his head slightly, eyes following Brock with a composure that felt almost deliberate. It was the look of something that had learned restraint the hard way. Gideon felt the breath leave his lungs. That gaze pulled a memory from him without permission, a K9 kneeling in dirt years ago, wounded but alert, watching Gideon as if waiting for instruction even as life slipped away. The past surged up hot and brutal. Gideon staggered half a step, boots sliding on slush. "Hey," Brock snapped. "You buying or staring?" Gideon swallowed. His voice, when it came, sounded rough, scraped raw by disuse. "Why the crate?" Brock shrugged. "Only way to keep him still. He doesn't attack, doesn't run, just ignores you like you don't exist." He laughed without humor. "Creeps people out." Gideon stepped closer, each movement controlled, careful not to startle himself or the dog. He crouched, knees protesting, bringing his eyes level with the crate. The shepherd shifted his weight once, muscles tightening, then settled again. His gaze locked onto Gideon's, assessing, measuring. Not pleading, not submissive. Something in Gideon's chest cracked open. This wasn't defiance. This was discipline stripped of context. A soldier without orders. "How old?" Gideon asked. "Don't know. Not a puppy. Got him off a guy passing through." Brock waved a dismissive hand. "Your problem if you want him." Gideon reached into his coat pocket and pulled out 3 crumpled $10 bills. The paper felt thin, almost absurdly small for the weight settling over him. He held the money out. "I'll take him." Brock blinked, surprise flickering across his face, then snatched the bills. No returns. He tossed a frayed leash onto the truck bed like an afterthought. Gideon unlatched the crate. The metal scraped loudly, and he felt the familiar spike of tension rise. But then the dog moved, slowly, carefully. He stepped out as if testing the ground, head high, tail low but steady. He did not bolt. He did not cower. He stood beside Gideon, close enough that Gideon could feel the warmth radiating through winter air. For a moment, neither of them moved. Snow drifted down, settling on Gideon's shoulders, catching in the dog's fur. The world seemed to hold its breath. Gideon exhaled long and controlled, as if accepting a challenge he had not gone looking for, but could no longer refuse. He clipped the leash on with hands that shook just slightly. The dog accepted it without resistance, eyes scanning the lot once, then returning to Gideon, as if waiting for the next cue. "We're going home," Gideon said quietly. His voice carried no command, only intention. "No one's locking you up again." The dog did not wag his tail. He did not resist. He simply walked, when Gideon walked, matching pace with an ease that sent a strange, painful warmth through Gideon's chest. Behind them, Brock Tiller shouted for the next buyer. Ahead, Gideon's truck waited near the trees, snow gathering on its hood. Gideon did not look back. Some things were not meant to be revisited. As they reached the passenger door, Gideon hesitated, unsure how this part was supposed to go. The shepherd solved the problem by climbing in on his own, circling once, then sitting upright, alert but calm, like a veteran claiming a familiar position. Gideon closed the door softly. He rested his forehead against the cold frame for a brief second, eyes shut, breath fogging the air. "I don't know what you are," he murmured, "but you're not alone anymore." Inside the truck, the dog watched him through the glass, silent and steady, as snow continued to fall, quiet, relentless, and strangely forgiving. Snow thickened by late afternoon, the light draining from Brackenridge with the quiet efficiency of winter. Gideon's house sat at the edge of town where the plowed road gave up, and the forest began a squat, weather-beaten structure backed by dark pines and a creek frozen hard enough to hold a man's weight. Smoke rose thinly from the chimney, barely visible against the white sky. Gideon parked the truck beside the garage and sat there longer than necessary, hands resting on the steering wheel. The German shepherd remained upright in the passenger seat posture, composed, head, level eyes, tracking Gideon's smallest movements through the glass. He didn't whine, didn't paw, he waited. That waiting unsettled Gideon more than panic ever had. Panic was loud, predictable. This was quiet attention, the kind that asked nothing and still demanded honesty. Inside the house, Gideon moved by habit. He shrugged off his coat, hung it on the same nail he had used for years, and kicked snow from his boots. The dog followed at a measured distance, nails clicking softly on the hardwood, stopping just inside the doorway, as if respecting an invisible boundary. Gideon noticed the pause. He didn't comment. He had learned the hard way that pressure broke more than it fixed. The living room was small and plain, furnished with what Gideon needed and little else. A worn couch faced a stone fireplace. A scarred coffee table bore faint ring marks from forgotten mugs. Framed photographs had been turned face down months ago, their edges still visible like gravestones no one wanted to read. Gideon pulled an old wool blanket from the hall closet. Its pattern faded to indistinct stripes, and spread it near the hearth, not too close to the fire, not too far from him. He set down a metal bowl of water and another of dry food. The dog approached the water first, drank deeply, then sat back on his haunches. He sniffed the food, once nostrils flaring, then turned his head away. Gideon felt a flicker of concern, but let it pass. Hunger, he knew, was not always the strongest instinct in a room full of unknowns. "You don't have to," Gideon said quietly, unsure whether he was talking to the dog or himself. Evening pressed in. Snow tapped at the windows with a sound like dry fingers. Gideon lit the fire and sank onto the couch, boots still on, hands folded loosely between his knees. The dog settled onto the blanket with care, curling his body to protect his flank head resting on crossed paws. His breathing was slow, deliberate. Gideon found himself counting the rise and fall, without realizing it, matching his own breath to that rhythm, until the tightness in his chest eased a fraction. He did not name the dog. Names turned into voices in your head. Names lingered when bodies didn't. Gideon had learned that lesson too well. Night arrived fully by 6. Gideon fixed a simple dinner he barely tasted, moving around the kitchen as if performing a drill learned long ago. The dog remained where he was, eyes half-lidded, but alert, tracking Gideon's movement with subtle shifts of his ears. Once, when a pan clattered against the sink, Gideon felt the familiar spike of heat climb his spine. He froze, breath hitching. The dog lifted his head instantly, body tensing, gaze snapping toward the source of the noise. He didn't bark. He didn't advance. He simply aligned himself between Gideon and the kitchen doorway, weight-balanced stance, protective but controlled. The moment passed. Gideon exhaled slowly, pulse still loud in his ears. He rubbed a hand over his face and let out a sound that might have been a laugh if it had carried any joy. "Guess we both hear things," he murmured. Later, Gideon left the bedroom door open when he went to bed. He lay staring at the ceiling, watching shadows from the fire dance across the walls. Sleep came in fragments. He dreamed of heat and pressure, of a moment frozen in time where his body refused to move. He woke gasping, heart racing, hands clawing at the sheets, as if trying to pull himself free from memory itself. For several seconds he didn't know where he was. The room felt wrong, too quiet, too still. Then he heard it, the soft scrape of nails on wood. The dog stood in the doorway, silhouetted by the faint glow of firelight from the living room. He didn't rush in, he didn't crowd. He simply stood there, watching Gideon as one might watch a man on unstable ground, ready to intervene if the fall came. Gideon pressed his feet to the floor, grounding himself in the cold. He drew in a breath, then another, counting silently until the ringing in his ears dulled. "It's fine," he whispered, though he wasn't sure who needed to hear it. The dog remained until Gideon's breathing slowed, then retreated a step, resuming his quiet vigil. Gideon lay back, eyes open, and let the night pass over him like weather. Morning arrived without fanfare. The sky lightened to a pale gray, snow still falling, but softer now, the flakes smaller, less insistent. Gideon brewed coffee he didn't finish and leaned against the counter, watching steam curl upward. The dog drank water again, then returned to his place near the hearth. He still ignored the food. Gideon filed the detail away, his old instincts stirring despite years of disuse. A knock sounded just after noon. Gideon stiffened automatically, shoulders tightening, mind racing through possibilities. The dog's ears flicked forward, body rising smoothly from the blanket. He positioned himself slightly ahead of Gideon, angled toward the door. Gideon opened it part way. Standing on the porch was Marrow Hale, a woman in her early 60s who lived 2 houses down. She was tall and spare, posture straight despite the cold, with silver hair cut short and practical beneath a knit cap. Her face was lined but not soft, her skin weathered by years of mountain sun and winter wind. She wore a long coat cinched at the waist and sensible boots dusted with snow. Marrow had once been a volunteer search and rescue coordinator, a role that had left her calm in crisis and unafraid of silence. Her eyes moved from Gideon's face to the dog behind him, taking in the animal's stance with professional curiosity. "You didn't sleep," she said, not unkindly. Gideon shrugged. "I'm fine." Marrow raised an eyebrow, unconvinced. "People who are fine don't flinch when doors knock." She nodded toward the dog. "Yours?" "Not exactly," Gideon said. She smiled faintly, the expression brief but genuine. "He's watching you," she observed. "That's a good sign." She stayed only a moment, leaving a container of soup on the porch and a few words of practical advice about the coming storm. When she left, the quiet felt less oppressive than before. The afternoon dragged on. Gideon decided to face the garage, not because it needed cleaning, but because avoiding it had shrunk his world enough. The garage was cold and smelled of oil and old wood. Tools hung neatly along one wall, arranged with the precision of a man who trusted order more than comfort. The dog followed him to the threshold and stopped, sitting just inside, eyes alert. Gideon lifted a crate onto a shelf. His hand slipped. The crate fell, metal striking concrete with a sharp crack that echoed through the space. The past surged forward, hot and blinding. Gideon's shoulders locked, breath caught halfway in. He was no longer in the garage. He was back in the noise and heat and chaos that had rewritten his life. The dog moved, not frantically, not hesitantly. He stepped forward and planted himself directly in front of Gideon, broad chest, squared body, a solid barrier, his head lowered slightly, eyes scanning the open door, then flicking back to Gideon. He held that position, muscles taut but controlled, until Gideon's breathing stuttered back into rhythm. The panic stalled, confused by resistance. Gideon sank onto a workbench, heart pounding for a reason he hadn't felt in years. "That wasn't luck," he said quietly. The dog eased back half a step, still close, as if acknowledging the moment had passed but remaining ready. Night fell again, snow whispering against the roof. Gideon slept little, but when he woke from fractured dreams, The dog was there, sometimes in the doorway, sometimes curled near the bed, always present. They did not touch. They did not need to. By morning, Gideon felt the deep ache of exhaustion settle into his bones, but beneath it stirred something else unfamiliar and tentative. Recognition. Two survivors occupying the same quiet, learning slowly that silence did not always mean danger. Outside, snow continued to fall. Inside, the house held its breath, and for the first time in a long while, Gideon did not feel entirely alone in doing the same. Morning arrived thin and colorless, the kind of winter dawn that felt less like a beginning and more like a pause. Snow continued to fall in small dry flakes barely visible against the whitewashed sky, settling into corners the plows never reached. Gideon stood in the open doorway of the garage, breath-fogging hands deep in the pockets of his flannel-lined jacket, weighing a decision that had nothing to do with tools. He had already proven, at least to himself, that the dog reacted with a precision no stray ever learned by accident. What Gideon hadn't tested was what came next, what happened after the first response, after the body did what it had been taught to do. He stepped fully inside the garage and pulled the door halfway down, muting the outside world without sealing it off completely. The garage was a narrow rectangle of concrete and cold, lit by a single bulb that hummed faintly overhead. The walls were lined with hooks and shelves, each tool hung in exact alignment. That order wasn't aesthetic, it was defensive. Gideon trusted things that stayed where he put them. The German shepherd followed him in this time, crossing the threshold without hesitation. He moved with a smooth, economical gait, nails clicking once, then stopping as he took position several feet to Gideon's left, close enough to matter, far enough not to crowd. In the clearer light, Gideon studied him more closely than he had allowed himself before. The dog was larger than average, around 90 pounds, built long and powerful rather than bulky. His coat, though dulled by neglect, showed the density and structure of a working animal. A faint scar traced the skin beneath his left shoulder, visible when he shifted. His muzzle had begun to gray slightly, suggesting an age closer to 6 or 7 than 5. These were not the signs of a failed dog. They were the marks of use. Gideon reached for a metal wrench and deliberately let it fall from waist height. The sound cracked through the garage, sharp, unforgiving. His body reacted before his mind. Shoulders locked, breath stalled, vision dimmed at the edges. But the spiral didn't complete itself because the dog was already moving. He stepped forward and angled his body, shoulder squared towards the open door, head lowered just enough to break Gideon's line of sight with the source of imagined threat. His eyes flicked back to Gideon's face, then outward again, measuring, assessing. He held the position, not rigid but ready. Gideon forced air into his lungs. He counted the breaths until the heat receded. When he looked again, the dog was still there, unwavering. "That's not instinct," Gideon said under his breath. "That's conditioning." He tested it again, lighter this time, tapping a steel rod against the workbench. The dog adjusted instantly, less urgency, same precision. A calibrated response. A tight knot formed beneath Gideon's ribs, equal parts dread and awe. He had spent years working alongside trained animals. He knew the difference between fear-driven reaction and learned protocol. This dog wasn't ignoring commands. He was waiting for the right ones. Later that afternoon, Gideon cleaned snow from the driveway as clouds thickened again, promising another heavy night. He was halfway through when a familiar truck pulled up and parked crookedly near the mailbox. Sheriff Rowan Clive stepped out, collar turned up against the cold. At 47, Rowan carried the solid build of a man who had aged into responsibility without ever growing comfortable in it. His hair was dark but thinning, worn longer than regulations strictly allowed, and his beard was trimmed close, streaked with gray at the chin. His eyes were sharp, restless, always scanning, even when his posture suggested ease. Rowan and Gideon had worked together years ago, back when Gideon still wore the uniform, and believed in clean lines between good and bad. The ambush that ended Gideon's career had altered Rowan too, made him quieter, more cautious, a man who trusted paperwork less and patterns more. Rowan's gaze landed immediately on the dog who had emerged from the house and now stood near Gideon's knee. "That yours?" Rowan asked. Gideon shook his head once. "Not exactly." Rowan crouched slightly, keeping his hands visible, his voice neutral. "Mind if I take a look?" The dog did not retreat. He shifted his weight subtly, placing himself just forward of Gideon's leg. Eyes on Rowan, but calm. Rowan noticed, his eyebrows lifted a fraction. "He's trained," Rowan said quietly. Gideon exhaled. "That's what I'm starting to think." Rowan straightened, breath puffing white. Towns had a run of warehouse break-ins near the rail line. Clean jobs, no alarms tripped, no witnesses. He glanced back at the dog. Animals like that don't end up in iron crates by accident. Gideon didn't answer right away. He looked down at the dog, at the steady presence that had already changed the shape of his days. In those amber eyes he saw neither expectation nor demand, only patience. "I'm not coming back," Gideon said finally. Rowan nodded. "I didn't ask you to." He paused. "But if you notice anything, let me know." That night snow fell, harder wind pressing against the house with a low, insistent moan. Gideon sat at the kitchen table, paperwork spread out in front of him. Old maintenance receipts, outdated maps of the rail spur things. He told himself he was only organizing. The dog lay near the doorway, head resting on his paws, eyes open. A sudden metallic bang echoed from somewhere outside, wind knocking loose a sheet of corrugated steel from the abandoned shed down the road. The sound slammed into Gideon's nervous system like a hammer. He dropped to one knee before he knew. He was moving, hands pressed to the floor, breath coming fast and shallow. The garage incident had been controlled. This wasn't. The noise had come from nowhere, uninvited, and it tore the present open. The dog closed the distance, not running, not hesitating. He pressed his body firmly against Gideon's side, weight, solid and grounding. His flank rose and fell in an exaggerated rhythm, slow, deliberate breaths. Gideon's fingers curled into the dog's fur without conscious thought. The texture was coarse, real, undeniable. He matched the rhythm instinctively, breath hitching, then slowing. The world narrowed to that contact, that shared cadence. Minutes passed. The panic loosened its grip. When Gideon finally lifted his head, his eyes burned with unshed tears. "You weren't ignoring anyone," he whispered hoarsely. "You were listening for something worth hearing." The dog eased back slightly, but stayed close, eyes still on Gideon's face. For the first time since the market, Gideon felt something shift. Not relief, not hope, but understanding. This animal had not failed. He had been failed. By morning, the storm had buried the town again. Gideon called the sheriff's office and left a message for Rowan. Not an offer, just an observation. "If those break-ins are using timing windows around freight schedules," he said, voice steady, "check the old spur east of the mill. There's cover there you won't see from the road." He hung up and looked down at the dog. "That's as far as I go," he said. The dog blinked slowly, then settled back onto the floor, content to wait. Outside, snow continued to fall. Inside, a former trooper and a discarded working dog shared a silence that no longer felt empty. It felt earned. The storm arrived with weight. Snow fell thick and wet, driven sideways by wind strong enough to make the house creak and the doors tremble, as if someone stood outside knocking with an insistent hand. Night swallowed Brackenridge early, the world beyond the windows, erased into a moving wall of white. Gideon did not bother with bed. Sleep had learned his patterns too well. Instead, he pulled on his jacket and went down to the garage, choosing the cold and the metal on purpose, the way one might choose to press a bruise to learn its edges. The garage light cast a harsh cone across concrete and steel. Shadows sharpened. Every surface seemed to hum with memory. Gideon ran his hand along the workbench fingers, grazing wrenches and clamps, each one a potential trigger. He breathed through his nose, slow and deliberate, grounding himself in the scrape of denim against his knees, the faint oil smell, the steady hum of the bulb. The German shepherd followed him down and stopped just inside the doorway, posture alert, but unintrusive amber eyes tracking Gideon's movements without urgency. "Just noise," Gideon muttered, more mantra than belief. "Just weather." Then the sound came. A steel door somewhere outside, likely the abandoned shed down the road, caught the wind wrong and slammed hard against its frame. The impact cracked through the night like a gunshot. Gideon's nervous system answered instantly. His body folded inward as if struck. He dropped to the floor, hands clamped over his head, breath tearing in short, useless bursts. The present vanished. Heat rushed in where cold had been. Pressure crushed his chest. He could hear shouting that wasn't there, feel grit in his mouth that didn't exist. His eyes were open, but he was no longer seeing the garage. He was back in the place his mind refused to bury. The dog moved. Not fast, not frantic. He closed the distance with measured steps and pressed his body firmly against Gideon's side. Shoulder braced into Gideon's ribs, weight solid and undeniable. It was not a nudge, it was an anchor. The dog's flank rose and fell in exaggerated arcs. Breath deep and slow, the rhythm impossible to ignore. Inhale, hold, exhale. Gideon's fingers found fur without permission, clutching at the coarse warmth, like a rope thrown into dark water. His lungs resisted at first, panic clawing for speed, but the dog did not change pace. He stayed. He breathed as if his life depended on Gideon's ability to follow. Seconds stretched into something looser. The noise in Gideon's head dulled. The heat receded. The floor beneath his palms returned to being cold concrete instead of burning ground. His breath finally aligned with the dog's rhythm, long exhales shaking as they left him. When he realized he was crying, the tears were already falling, hot tracks cutting through the cold on his cheeks. He laughed then, one broken sound, half sob, half disbelief. That's why he whispered, voice hoarse. That's why you don't listen to anyone. He pressed his forehead briefly to the dog's neck, feeling the steady pulse there. You listen to the ones who are breaking. The dog eased back only when Gideon's breathing steadied, remaining close enough to matter. He did not seek praise. He did not seek touch. He simply stayed present, eyes never leaving Gideon's face. Something inside Gideon shifted, not with fireworks, but with quiet certainty. Names were dangerous, yes, but some things needed words to become real. He swallowed, tasting salt. Hearth, he said softly, the word forming before he could overthink it. That's what you are. The hearth was the center of a house, the place warmth came from, without noise or spectacle. The dog's ears flicked once, subtle acknowledgement, and then he settled beside Gideon, body angled protectively. By the time dawn crept in, gray and hesitant, the storm had softened. Snow still fell, but lighter now, flakes drifting instead of driving. Gideon did not sleep. He sat against the garage wall with Hearth at his side, listening to the slow rhythm that had saved him hours earlier. For the first time since the ambush years ago, the guilt did not scream. It spoke quieter, like something finally willing to be heard. Morning arrived late, as winter mornings did. Gideon brewed coffee and ignored it. Watching steam fade into the air, Hearth drank water, then sat, posture unchanged, still refusing food. Gideon noticed the careful way Hearth favored one shoulder when rising, the faint stiffness after stillness. His old instincts stirred, sharpened by concern rather than duty. He picked up the phone and dialed the only veterinarian in town he trusted. Dr. Sable Quinn answered on the second ring. At 54, Sable carried herself with a calm authority earned by decades of work, in places where help arrived late and questions were never simple. She was tall and broad-shouldered, her dark hair streaked with gray and pulled into a practical braid. Her skin was weathered by sun and wind, eyes sharp behind rectangular glasses that never seemed to slip. She had grown up on a ranch outside Brackenridge, left for veterinary school, and returned with the unglamorous determination of someone who chose usefulness over prestige. "Bring him in," she said, after Gideon explained, "sooner rather than later." The clinic smelled of disinfectant and old paper. Gideon did not sit in the waiting room. He stood near the wall, one hand resting lightly on Harth's shoulder, unconsciously placing himself between the dog and the rest of the space. Harth remained calm, posture upright, eyes alert but unthreatened. Sable emerged from the exam room and assessed them in a single glance. "You're Gideon," she said, "and you must be the dog." "He's Harth." Gideon replied, the name sounding more solid now. Sable nodded and gestured them inside. The exam room was small and warm. Harth stepped onto the mat without prompting, positioning himself, where Sable indicated movements efficient and practiced. Sable noticed. She always noticed. She did not comment, only watched as she examined joints and muscle tone with gentle precision. "This shoulder," she murmured, fingers tracing beneath the fur. "Old trauma. He compensated well. Whoever trained him did it right." She paused, then reached for a handheld scanner. "Let's see if he's chipped." The scanner beeped faintly, then steadied. Sable's brows drew together. She adjusted the angle, tried again. The beep returned clearer this time. She read the screen in silence, jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. "This isn't a civilian chip," she said finally. "Military issue, older model." Gideon's chest tightened. "You're sure I trained on these early in my career?" Sable replied. "They're not used anymore. Too fragile." She looked up at him. "It's damaged, but there's enough data to tell me he was registered as a working dog. Status: missing. Presumed deceased." The words landed with blunt force. Gideon sank into the chair without realizing his knees had given way. Missing. Another survivor written off because paperwork couldn't hold what war broke. How does a dog like him end up in a crate at a snow market? Gideon asked, voice hollow. Sable leaned back against the counter. "There are ways," she said carefully. "Sometimes injured tugs get passed along. Sometimes records fail. And sometimes people don't care." She met Gideon's gaze. "But discipline like that doesn't disappear. It waits." Harth stood between them, tail still, eyes calm, as if the past being discussed had no power over the present moment. Gideon placed a hand on Harth's back, grounding himself in muscle and warmth. "I won't let them take you," he said quietly. Sable nodded once. "Good, he'll need time and care, but he's strong." They left the clinic with answers Gideon hadn't known he was ready to hear. Outside, snow drifted gently, the world softer than it had been the night before. In the truck, Harth settled into the passenger seat with the same quiet competence he had shown from the beginning. "You weren't broken," Gideon said as he started the engine. "You were waiting." Harth's ears flicked. The road home curved through white silence, and for the first time in years, Gideon did not feel like survival was the end of the story. The clinic doors closed behind them with a muted click, and the sound seemed to seal a chapter Gideon hadn't known he was still reading. Outside, snow drifted in a softer register than the storm, before flakes moving without urgency, as if the night had spent its fury and decided to listen. Gideon stood by the truck for a moment with Harth at his side, one gloved hand resting at the base of the dog's neck, feeling the steady warmth that had already become a kind of language. The word missing still echoed in his head, missing, presumed deceased, an administrative phrase that had once been used to explain away men he'd known, too. He started the engine and drove, not quickly, not slowly, letting the tires hum over packed white while the town's edges slid past in gray silhouettes. Rowan Clive called before Gideon reached the house. The sheriff's voice carried the same careful cadence it always had, a tone shaped by years of speaking into radios, where every word mattered. "Sable sent me the partial," Rowan said. "Old working registration. The rail spur lines up. We've been tracing inventory that shouldn't move equipment that doesn't show on manifests. Your dog being sold at a snow market doesn't feel random anymore. Gideon listened without interrupting, eyes on the road, shoulders set forward. He did not agree to return to duty. He did not need to. "I'll walk the perimeter," he said, when Rowan paused. "I'll look, that's all." There was a brief silence, then Rowan answered, "That's enough." They met near the warehouses just after dusk, the hour when winter turned the world blue and flat. Rowan arrived with 2 deputies, both younger men, whose names Gideon didn't ask for, faces drawn tight against cold and nerves. They wore their jackets, zipped high, breath-steaming hands hovering near radios. Gideon wore plain clothes, the old jacket that fit him like memory. Hearth stayed close, head level, tail, still his presence quiet but unmistakable. The dog's coat had been brushed clean. The scar beneath his left shoulder was visible when he shifted a pale crescent that caught the light and disappeared again. The search began methodically. Gideon paced himself, keeping his breathing slow, eyes scanning the places where shadow deepened. The warehouses loomed like blunt instruments, their corrugated sides rattling faintly in the wind. Metal sang when touched by cold. Somewhere far down the line, a loose panel clanged, and Gideon felt the familiar hitch in his chest, but Hearth stepped half a pace forward, body angled to break Gideon's line of sight, eyes lifting to meet his. The moment passed. Gideon nodded once and kept moving. They found the young man near the river bend, wedged between pallets where the snow drifted deeper and the wind cut cleaner. He was alive, hypothermic, shaking, but breathing. Gideon knelt without thinking, words steady and simple, as he guided the man back to awareness. Hearth stood guard, a living barrier against the cold and the dark. When the medics arrived, relief moved through the group like a tide. Rowan clapped Gideon's shoulder once, firm and brief. "You still have it," he said. Gideon shook his head. "I never lost it," he replied. "I stopped trusting it." The weeks that followed did not feel like victory. They felt like work. Rowan's investigation widened quietly, names surfacing, routes aligning. Gideon remained an advisor, unofficial, unbadged, walking where he was asked to walk, noticing what he had trained himself to notice. Hearth accompanied him when it made sense and stayed home when it didn't, content to wait, content to watch. The dog ate better now, appetite returning in careful increments, favoring his shoulder less as Sable's treatment took hold. At home, Gideon began to speak again, not commands, not praise, but narration. He talked through small tasks, voiced doubts he had carried alone. Hearth listened, eyes tracking ears, flicking at the right moments, a partner in the simplest sense. The community room opened its doors on a Tuesday evening with folding chairs set in a loose circle. Gideon did not stand at the front. He sat among them, 4 men and 2 women, at first each carrying a posture shaped by vigilance. One of the women was Etta Rowe, late 50s, a retired firefighter with shoulders still squared by ladders and heat. Her hair was iron gray and cropped short. Her skin bore the quiet map of burns she never mentioned. She spoke little, listened hard. Another was Cal Marin, early 40s, former EMT, hands restless as if searching for gloves he no longer wore. Gideon spoke plainly. He did not promise cure. He described freezing and returning. He described a dog who pressed close and breathed when breathing was impossible. Hearth lay at his feet, head on paws, breathing slow. No one laughed. A few nodded. 1 man came back the next week. Then 2. On a Sunday afternoon, Gideon drove back to the snow market. The stalls were different now, spring gear replacing winter cast-offs, but the ground remembered. He parked where the iron crate had been and stood for a moment with his hands in his pockets. Hearth waited at his side, posture relaxed, tail giving one small, certain sweep. There was nothing to confront, no score to settle. Gideon turned away with the knowledge that some places marked you, and some marks healed into scars that no longer bled. The paperwork arrived quietly. Rowan slid a folder across the desk one morning, eyes steady. The designation was careful, the language precise, advisory role, training support field assistance when appropriate. Dual registration for Hearth followed service and working. Gideon signed with a hand that did not shake. "You don't owe us," Rowan said. Gideon looked down at Hearth, who sat at his side as if the chair arrangement had always been planned. "I owe myself," Gideon replied. "And him." The ceremony was small, no speeches beyond what needed saying. Etta stood near the back, arms crossed, eyes bright. Cal lingered afterward, asking about breathing, about staying present, when sound cut too deep. Gideon answered honestly. Hearth accepted attention with patience, eyes returning to Gideon between greetings, checking in. The town did not make a fuss. It left bowls of water out. It lowered voices when Hearth passed. Children asked to scratch ears. Hearth allowed it with a solemnity that made Gideon smile. That night the wind lifted and dropped the same loose panel down by the spur. The sound traveled sharp and familiar. Gideon felt the reflex surge, and then he felt the pressure at his side, the warmth, the breath. He counted with Hearth and stayed. Later he recorded a short memo, voice calm. "PTSD didn't disappear," he said. "It didn't win tonight." He set the phone down and rested his back against the garage wall. Hearth settled beside him, the hearth in truth, now warmth without spectacle. $30 had changed hands in a snow market, and a second assignment had begun, not to chase ghosts or outrun fire, but to hold a line where others could stand. Gideon closed his eyes, not to escape, but to rest in the quiet knowledge that the work would continue, and he would not do it alone. Sometimes the miracles God sends do not arrive with thunder or fire. They arrive quietly, wrapped in snow and silence, through a broken man who believes he has failed. And a wounded Tom the world decided was no longer useful. Gideon thought surviving was his shame, but God turned survival into purpose. He thought the $30 he paid was an act of mercy, but heaven knew it was an appointment. The dog was not disobedient. He was faithful beyond the wrong hands that held him. The man was not weak. He was carrying a battle no one else could see. And when they found each other, God reminded us of a truth we forget too easily. Nothing that endures pain is ever wasted. In our daily lives, we pass by people and souls who look silent, withdrawn, difficult, or forgotten. A neighbor who no longer smiles. A veteran who avoids noise. An animal no one wants. A person who doesn't listen anymore. What if they are not broken? What if they are simply waiting for the right kind of love? God often places quiet miracles directly in our path, not to impress us, but to test our compassion. And when we choose to stay, when we choose patience over judgment, presence over fear, healing begins. Not all at once, but enough to take the next step. If this story touched your heart, please share it so someone else who is hurting can find hope tonight. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from. We read everyone. Subscribe to the channel to support stories that restore faith in humanity, one quiet miracle at a time. May God bless you, protect you, and give you strength in battles others cannot see. And may He remind you gently and clearly, you are not forgotten, you are not finished, and even the quietest breath can be a miracle when God is still watching.